Good afternoon. I'm Martha Minow, and it is with utter joy and delight that I will be interviewing two distinguished public servants, two distinguished academics, and two longtime friends. So because they are friends, I am going to call them by their first names, and I have their approval to do so. Harold Hong-Jung Ko, as everyone I think knows, is Sterling Professor of International Law at Yale Law School, where he returned after his service as legal advisor to the U.S. Department of State. And he previously served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. He is HLS class of 1980. Come on. Thank you. And it just so happens that his father is a graduate with an LLM and SJD. He came here on asylum from Korea, and his sister also. And he told me recently something I did not know. He was baptized at the church, the Harvard Epworth Church right here.
Where my brother was baptized at the same time.
Oh, my gosh. Somewhere along the way, he slipped in distinguished service as a dean of the Yale Law School, and I'm not going to say any more because he told me not to. Ambassador Samantha Power has worked as a journalist in Bosnia during the Balkans conflict, as a founding leader of the Carr Center for Human Rights at the Kennedy School of Government, professor, author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, which she began as a third-year paper.
For a professor sitting next to me.
Who did not get the Pulitzer Prize on her own book. So you are two idealists who went into government. John F. Kennedy once said, "I'm an idealist without illusions." And I'm wondering if you would describe yourselves that way now. Are you still idealists? How do you think about the gap, if there is one, between what you hoped for and what you found in the government? We will talk first about some smaller subjects. We're going to move up to that one. We're going to also talk about maybe some current issues under the administration of President Trump and thoughts about dealing with the very difficult issues in the age of Twitter, fake news, polarization, black and white thinking, small topics. Warm-up questions. Confirmation hearings experiences, best moments, worst moments?
Harold was confirmed first, so he should go first. And it took him longer, so he has more stories.
So the worst moment was that I had advocated that the U.S. ratify the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And in Belarus, they have a holiday which says that women cannot work outside the home. And so the committee that evaluates this said it was discriminatory against women. Now, that holiday happened to be called Mother's Day. And at my confirmation hearing, my mother is sitting behind me, and I told my mother, whatever you do, don't make any facial expressions. And one of the senators says to me, "I understand you're opposed to Mother's Day. And, I happen to love my mother. I don't know about you." And meanwhile, my mother is just infuriated, so she's making faces, moving, and I look back, and my her granddaughter, my daughter, is trying to calm her down. Anyway, that was the worst moment. The best moment, but also in a lot of ways the worst moment, was I was opposed because as the dean of the law school at Yale, I went to a fundraiser, and someone said, "Does your curriculum at Yale Law School include Sharia law?" And I said, if someone makes a contract and they select Sharia law, you have to know it. And so anyway, this became the sort of meme on the internet, Ko favors Sharia law. And so when we're coming up for the, I had to get, enough votes to get cloture. And I get called by someone, I better not say the country, but he says, "The former ambassador to this country is a big fan of yours because you served together before, And so I think he's going to vote for you even though he's a Republican. And I said, how do you know him? He said, well, he's my best friend, and my daughter is actually his staff person who's writing the talking points, so he'll vote for you. So on the day of the vote, we're watching on TV, and the senator comes down, and he's hanging around the desk, and then they suddenly say, 1 minute left, and then it says, Senator so-and-so votes no. And I thought, well, they're supposed to vote yes. And, meanwhile, we're not sure whether I got through or not. And then they count, and they said, I went through by 1 vote.
Wow.
And then my cell phone rings. It's my friend, and he says, did you see what happened? And I said, yeah, he voted against me. He said, no, he was for you before he was against you. And he said, he went down to the desk, and if they were going to vote against you, he was going to vote for you, and you would have gotten through. And I said, well, tell him thanks. And then my son says, you just thanked some guy for voting against you. Well, that's Washington.
I had a version of that on the back end, which was I thought one of my biggest supporters was a senator who voted against me in my confirmation, which ended up being a little bit smoother than Harold's, or my husband, Cass Sunstein's, which was epic. It was epic proportional to the amount that he has written. So that gives you some idea of how epic. But I had an exchange similar to Harold's, but I called this guy after because I really thought we clicked, and he had worked very closely with Cass, and I'd met him 3 times in the pre-confirmation process, and then I saw him vote no, just go and do the no thing. And I was like, oh, he made a mistake, like he's going to correct it. And so I called him, and he immediately let the call through. I'd gotten confirmed, so I was in an otherwise great mood. And he said, let's just say you had more supporters than votes. I'm like, profiling courage, But this is how this works. So the hardest thing for me, and Harold has been through it twice, right? You've been confirmed twice. So I only went through it in order to go from being a White House staff member to being in my dream job as UN ambassador. And I had written a lot, again, not compared to my spouse, but compared to most mortals. And so I knew that they would pore over what I had written and what I had said, and I think, like all of us, Martha, Harold, Cass, we never write with an eye to, is someone going to look at this, and make some judgment about me in some future day. You write what you think, and you make it as precise and analytically sound as you can. But when the president told me he was going to put me forward, then I began to have panic attacks, thinking back to all the things that I had said that could be either taken out of context or, frankly, just, people are going to find them problematic because they're views and people have different views on the earth. So it turned out that as I went over everything, the most problematic thing that I had written from the standpoint of the audience that I was confronting was something that actually was very influenced by my work with Martha when I was a student here and her work since, which was on the question of reckoning with misdeeds. And if as a country you've done things that are bad, I think in the United States there's a sort of fresh innocence that each new administration brings, as if we're not really affiliated with what has happened before us. So many of us in the Obama administration opposed the war in Iraq, and we think that counts for a lot with other countries. But in fact, we're still the United States, a country that went into Iraq in the way that it did, and with some of the consequences that it did. So anyway, so I had written this thing in the New Republic saying that it was important that the United States reckon. And when I went back and read the sentence when I was in this anticipatory state, I was just thinking this is not going to go well. But the United States should reckon with the crimes that we have, or it has, committed, abetted, or ignored or something. So it was like doing, complicit, and then bystanding. And so as I went through this process, you do this thing called murder boards, where some of your friends and your associates and the people you're going to work with come and they gather around you and they start interrogating. It's like the Inquisition.
Moot court.
Like moot court, exactly. And so Cass, my husband, my new husband, I just married him at the time, knew that one of my least favorite things was to be called Powers. And so every time in this murder board, he would ask me a question, he would say, Miss Powers. And then he'd say things like, aren't you for some big treaty, like to govern our lives? Aren't you the person who loves big treaties? But the one that people kept coming back to is, Miss Powers, for which crimes should the United States reckon? And so, the right answer, according to people who very much wanted me to get confirmed and be in the job as soon as possible, was to either repudiate what I had said or, basically say something affirmative and happy about America. But I wanted to answer the question. And so we went through, I probably had 20 murder boards where I just could not do this in a manner that was going to allow me to take up my position as UN ambassador. Like, I just kept... And so finally, I decided that I needed to find a way to say something that was also true. So if I couldn't talk about Abu Ghraib or this or that, I could just talk about things that I do believe. And one of the things I believe is that America's an amazing country. I'm an immigrant to this country. Harold's family immigrated to this country. We get to be in the jobs we're in. And so I developed this little routine where I would, when I was asked the question by anybody, I would talk about how much I loved America. And that was my answer. And so if you go to YouTube, and then I'll end this story, painful story to recollect, you will see the craziest exchange between two members of the human race that I can imagine, where Marco Rubio, predictably, asked me for what crimes, should America apologize, right? And I think you can see him because he expects me to just say, oh, I misspoke, or that was excessive, but instead I said, this is the most incredible country. I love this country. America's the greatest country on earth. I would never apologize for America. And you could just see his face. He's like, but I mean, for which, like you said this thing, for which crimes, as I said, Senator, this country, I can't tell you what it was like to come to this country when I was an immigrant to this country, just what the flag meant to me. This is the greatest country. I would never, ever apologize for it. And meanwhile, I'm watching the clock, and I'm just know that I've got to get through, what is it, they had the 5 minutes or the 3 minutes or and it just goes back. And so he's like, finally, he's like, okay, so let me get this straight. I'm asking you for which crimes we should, and you're telling me America is the greatest country on earth? Like, yes, Senator. And I was confirmed 87-10.
You're here.
Somehow.
So you each worked in these crucial jobs with large teams of people. How did law school prepare you or not prepare you to do that? To work with large teams of people, with politics as well as law? What lessons did you learn about working with your staffs and across your staff with other staffs?
When you say large teams of people, there are different groups. That I was the head of a law firm, the Legal Advisor's Office, which has about 220 lawyers and 25 different offices. Many of them are the great experts on the subject that they're doing, climate change or aerospace or the use of force. With that group of people, I just said to them, if you win, I win. And if we win, America wins. And I just tried to become as close to them personally as possible. Whenever anybody new got hired, I asked them to come and see me on the first day because I thought it was so important that people felt like they had a relationship with me because they were supposed to speak for me. We also had many interagency meetings, and some of my colleagues from those interagency meetings are here. And in those meetings, you try to find common ground with people who, frankly, have different portfolios from you. And, but you can always find something on which you can connect.
Red Sox.
That was with her. There are a lot of Yankees fans, and when that came up, I tried to stay away from the topic. I couldn't negotiate my way out of that one.
When I was at law school, and I haven't had an administrative role like either of you, my wing woman and wing man are these two iconic deans of the two great law schools in this country. I know there are others. Good law schools and other good deans, I'm sure. But these guys are the cream of the crop. But I was a loner as a student and had come from having been a war correspondent and was a bit alienated, I think it's fair to say, when I got here. They now have a class, actually, that Cass is teaching on like legislation and policy and administration, and I wish in my day they'd had something like that would have brought home how law, in the first year, how law can really matter for real people. So congrats to you, Martha, for introducing that. Or had I been at Yale Law School, I would have been in Harold's clinic, trying to get refugees into this country or deal with Guantanamo inmates, or the amazing work he's done over the years. But I was sort of a little bit removed. I think what I took from law school was what so many take, which is just the importance of analytic precision. And I think what bothered me about law school at one point was a sense of kind of moral equivalence, or that it was all just felt very removed in the experience I had, at least in the first year or two, from the world. But then I had the turning point that, in the best law school experiences people get the chance to have, which is when you realize that your convictions haven't gone anywhere, the things you care about haven't gone anywhere. Now you just are going to be better at pursuing those convictions and more rigorous and more precise and more likely to anticipate what others are going to throw at you. And so I think I really brought a lot from law school, actually, to my team of people who worked for me when I was UN ambassador, and that was the biggest team that I've had the chance to work with, in getting them to think in those ways, like that it's just not enough, to want to promote LGBT rights or to want to let, X number of Syrian refugees into this country. We have to find a way to meet people where they are, anticipate their objections, and then transcend them somehow. And that meant both them with other countries as we're trying to build coalitions or get resolutions through, but most critically, because most of the weightiest things you do in government in a funny way are internal. It's when you try to get your own government to be the best version of itself as you see it. And so for them to go into every meeting, not simply thinking, what do I believe and what do I think are the strong arguments, but having anticipated what's going to come at them, around the table, to me, that's the rigor and the training you get out of law school, puts you in a position to do that, I think, in an optimal way.
Both of you are eloquent beyond belief. Harold, you've actually coined the term the legal advisor's duty to explain, and described it as a loyalty that the government legal advisors owe not just to their clients and ministers, but also to their publics and national citizenry. And your commitment to transparency and explaining is quite distinctive. So I wonder, can you tell us about controversial occasions or occasions where controversy made that a challenge to performing that duty to explain and dealing with issues like there are classified information that you can't explain? And how do you manage that duty to explain in the age of Twitter?
So I don't know how to use Twitter. So that's how I manage that. In international law, there's customary international law is state practice followed out of a sense of legal obligation, or as it's called, opinio juris. So if your country is a leading country in this process, as the United States is, and it's doing something that it thinks it's lawful, it needs to explain that for it to be international law and for it to start a trend toward international law. So early in my time, there's drones started being used and they were controversial. And I said I thought we should make a public statement of our position on drones. When we thought they were lawful and when we thought they weren't lawful, because otherwise people would question whether we were following the law or not. Now, everybody in the meetings, internal meetings, thought they were lawful, but we had not articulated the rationale as clearly as we should have. And so the process of giving that speech actually generated more clarity and consensus. But one of the most amazing things I remember about that was I decided that I would give this speech at the American Society of International Law meeting in April 2010. There were there are a couple thousand people there. To make sure that I had speech to give, I wrote about our office wrote about a 40-minute speech, and then the last 15 minutes were on drones. But when I stood to give the speech, the last 15 minutes had not yet been fully cleared. I mean, it had to be cleared by 100 people. And so I'm giving the first part of the speech, and I'm wondering which ending I'm going to give. And then suddenly from the back of the room, in comes the assistant legal advisor working on the issue, and he runs up to the podium, and he sticks on the last 8 pages. And it's all marked up in red and all this stuff. And
Redacted.
well, some things were dropped, but so it gets to this point, and your colleague Jack Goldsmith describes it by saying, at that point in the speech, Coe became riveted to his text. Because if I didn't read word for word what had been cleared, it wasn't the position of the United States. I did a similar thing with regard to our rules of cyber conflict. I tried to do it again with regard to whether we thought that certain human rights treaties forbidding torture apply extraterritorially. I also tried to do it again in a speech I gave in Georgetown about our policies of what constitutes agreements that bind the United States, for example, the Paris climate deal and the Iran nuclear deal. And I think it's just a good thing for the legal advisor to do, because other countries are looking to us and trying to figure out whether we have a rationale. So saying nothing or twittering something is not the same as writing a legal opinion.
Tweeting. Just tweeting.
Ambassador Power, you certainly are someone who has tried to explain the United States, but sometimes to an internal audience in the United States, sometimes to a global audience. How should an ambassador navigate those issues and speaking for those multiple audiences, along with the issues of secrecy, diplomacy, loyalty to the U.S., et cetera?
These questions are all so great. They're making me think sort of thoughts I haven't had before, which is always a good sign. I'd say a few things. The thought I had when Harold was speaking is, number one, the number of times I sat in my Security Council chair with the United States of America in front of me when things were being broadcast live on TV, which doesn't happen that often, but at the height of the Ukraine crisis, different moments in the Syria crisis, just be on live on CNN or on Fox or on MSNBC. And I'd be sitting there saying, to my staff, who I was normally, I hope, relatively nice to, but in these moments, not my finest moments of generous leadership, where the fuck is my speech? But I'd be there, United States of America, like all happy, God, where's I need my speech? And because, I can wing it, and that's maybe another thing that comes out of law school, you know the core of your argument, you can be, hopefully, find a way to express what you need to express, but there's this issue of the clearance process. Like Samantha and Harold don't just get to decide what U.S. policy is on a given day, much though we might have tried. So I just identify so much with that. I hadn't heard that story before about the drones, and I identify with. Then the second thought I had, and only 3, but the second is that to some degree what Harold was saying reminds me of something that I used to do with a very, very different audience, and in many ways a more impressionable audience than the legal community, and that is my son, who was, for between 5 and basically 8 years, I guess 4 and 7 years old when I was UN ambassador. And, I would come home. Cass was teaching here while I was in New York, and so during the week it was me and my young son and my daughter, when I was able to be home with them. And some days I'd come home, and the Ukraine crisis was the first really high-profile conflict that I was involved in, where, I come into the UN Security Council, Russia's just gone into Crimea, I'm sitting at the Security Council, lights are flashing, cameras everywhere. I'm thinking, this is just like what it must have been like in Hungary, when they went into Hungary in 1956, or they cracked down Czechoslovakia in '68, and it just felt so anachronistic and crazy that this was happening. And then I had that moment of like, and then it's like, those great standoffs that we've all read about and that I was so steeped in between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and I'm like kind of drifting off and thinking about, and then I'm like, oh. Now I'm America. Like I'm America. I gotta beat America in that confrontation. And so I had very memorable exchanges, calling the Russians out on what they were doing and so forth, and I think important ones for what they were worth in terms of moving public opinion at the UN, because a lot of countries would want to duck issues like this. And then sometimes, particularly if I've been out of the office, away from home for a long time because of the intensity of these crises and having meetings in the Situation Room until all hours of the night, and I'd get a window and I'd take my son and I'd take him just out for a burger before I'd go back to the office or something. And so one of these early sessions, I was describing my clash with the Russian ambassador, and he said this and then I said this, and I was likening it to if Putin came in and he took your toys, and like how you, and but I was kind of feeling as if I'd made a powerful statement and it was getting favorable coverage, and people felt like I had adequately represented the United States in standing up against Russian aggression. And then my boy just looks at me and he's listening and he's totally into it, and he gets like taking somebody's land and how wrong it is, and then he's like, "But Mommy, did they leave? Did they leave Crimea?" Oh man, that is exactly the right question. And if I ever forget that and get enamored with like, oh, I really nailed the argument and missed the larger point, that's when I've lost my soul in this job. And then the last example I just give is, I think that we have to in these jobs, one, we need to do, and this is a longer conversation, but we need to do a better job of selling what we're doing internationally clearly, given what's happened in this country and the degree of polarization domestically. But my little neck of the woods was the UN, where we also weren't really in the practice of humanizing the things that we were trying to get done in a manner that would convince anybody. And so there are sort of these habits of interaction that had grown up over many years, habits of diplomacy. They exist at NATO, at the OSCE. They exist in bilateral meetings between foreign ministers. And it's like, you almost had to be a bit of a newcomer to just walk in and say, this is A, boring, B, repetitive, C, no one's listening to each other. They're all on their phones, doing God knows what, sort of like some law school classrooms these days. When I'm back teaching here, we were not having laptops in my classroom. Just future warning. But I wish I could have banned phones from the Security Council, because the kind of back and forth that you imagine these things. Anyway, so I decided that if I couldn't bring the sort of man to the mountain of bringing the Security Council to every place where the consequences of our actions or inactions were being felt, then we needed to bring, kind of mountain to man, I guess. And so, for instance, during the Ebola crisis, it was such, you'd have the UN briefing with a number of statistics, and these were, eye-popping statistics of how many people were going to die, but there was some way that the UN managed to make the imminent death of 1.4 million people, kind of not that newsworthy, and it was just, and so I thought, what can we do? Let's get someone from the region. They can't get out because of all the travel issues at the height of the epidemic, but let's get them to the UN base and beam them into this discussion. And we had this health worker, I'm still in touch with, Jackson Nema, who was working for MSF. He was just wasn't like a doctor or a trained nurse or anything, he was just somebody who stepped up to the call. And he told the story of people coming and trying to get into the MSF clinic, the Doctors Without Borders clinic, and there being no beds and no facilities, because that was the point we were at the epidemic. It was just before, just as President Obama was deciding to send 3,000 troops and health workers into the eye of the storm, thus enabling me to build, and Kerry to build a big global coalition that managed to end the epidemic unbelievably. We didn't know that that's where this was going at that time, and Jackson just described like a man carrying his daughter and begging him, to be able to leave his daughter there so his daughter could get care. And, you know, Jackson had me say no, because the treatment needed to be just so, and there were all kinds of infection control issues that were what were causing health workers and others to get infected. And he described the man leaving his daughter at the entrance to the clinic on the road, just knowing he was leaving her to die. And there's that, and what that felt like for him, which he described. But then there's also the fact that the man went back to his family having carried his daughter and was going to infect everyone around him, because that's how the epidemic. And so this is your reaction. I'm about to cry right now. This is all these years later. You can imagine in the Security Council at this time, for it's the only time I ever saw people just, and he ended his thing by saying, if you do not act, we will all be wiped out. We will all be wiped out. And policies are made elsewhere. They're not made in New York. These guys, the ambassadors there, largely are following instructions. But all I knew was that because the human was introduced, and someone had communicated the stakes of this in a way that I never could have on my own, that each of those individuals in the room at least became allies and advocates, to try to get their governments to do more.
Put their phones down, too.
Yeah, in that.
It's kind of poignant. We're in this room that was named for Jean Vorenberg, which is the only room in the law school that has on the walls pictures of clients, pictures of people. And that was one of the reasons, was let's think about the people whose lives are affected by the law. So there's Tinker. We can go through them at some point. So that's quite an image to hold in our minds. I wanted to ask you each to say something about a highlight of your times in government. You've just given us one. I can supply them, but do you want to offer one?
Well, one incident that got a lot of attention was I went to China for a meeting, and while I'm there, I get a call. I was in the town of Chengsheng, and it was the chief of staff for Secretary Clinton, and she says, I'm in the office, and I realize it's 3 in the afternoon, so it must be 3 in the morning. I said, you're in the office, and she said, can you get to Chengdu and call me on a secure phone? And I say to my handler, how far away is that? They said, 4 hours away. And I said, can I talk to you about it now? And she said, no, because of what happened. So she said, get there and call me. And then I said, is anybody in my office working on this? And she said, yes, your deputy, who is also in the office at 3 in the morning. Wow. So I call her, and I said, what's going on? And she said, you need to get to a secure phone. And then I said, is this like the thing with the scientist, which was Fang Lizhi, had gone into our embassy? And she said, yeah, but he has different physical characteristics. And then I realized that she must be talking about Chen Guangcheng, who is this famous blind human rights activist. So I concluded that I must be, he must have tried to come into our embassy in Beijing. So they say, go to the train station where you are, and we have U.S. diplomats in every line. And whichever one is closest to the front, you go there. So I go, and there are 7 lines, and I see this blonde hair right near the front. And I run up to, and the guy goes, get on the train, we're going to go to Chengdu. We jump on the train, and we're sitting there. I don't even know his name. Then he said, I saw you at Harvard Law School. And he said, I worked at a law firm, and I was in the East Asian Legal Studies program, and now I'm a member of the diplomatic corps. And I said, didn't you guys have an incident in Chengdu where someone came into the embassy? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, look, I got nothing but time. So he tells me all about it. And we get to Chengdu, and I call back, and they say, yes, this blind Chinese activist escaped from house arrest. He's broken his foot, and he's outside asking to come into our embassy. Secretary Clinton would like him to come in, but she won't do it unless you give your legal opinion. And what we're concerned about is that we don't want everybody in the whole world to claim a right to come into our embassies. So I said, well, what if the United States claims a right to admit him for a purpose of getting medical care, which he can't receive elsewhere? I said, we could narrow that. And on that basis, they admitted him. At which point I went and flew to Beijing, and there he was. And we sat together for 14 days. Meanwhile, during the whole thing, this largest meeting of 250 U.S. officials with the Chinese government is going on. And Secretary Clinton was dealing with that all publicly. Meanwhile, in the back door, we're trying to persuade him to leave the embassy. And so we end up calling and making an arrangement that he go to NYU because we thought that he could go to NYU Shanghai or switch to NYU New York if it all went south. And the negotiations went on for a long time. The main message that I learned, though, is you have to take cultural context into account. Because what finally happened is that the Chinese finally decided that they didn't want this to mess up the negotiations or the broader discussion, and that they would let him leave the country, but they had to do it their way. So we're watching TV and getting ready for the final announcement, and we had written two speeches, one which slammed them, and one which was sort of moderate and said, we'll see what happens next. And so they said, the foreign ministry announces that he is allowed to apply for a visa to go to America. And we had a meeting, and suddenly everybody says, well, that's a disaster. He's allowed to apply. He could be rejected. And so I think we should give the speech slamming them. And I said, wait, this is Asia. I said, the enforcement device here is not consideration, it's face. I said, have you ever heard an Asian father say, my kid is applying to Harvard? If they're applying, that thinks they're going to get in. And we have to respect their right to make the final decision. But I said, he's going to get the visa, so I think we should give the other speech. So that's the speech they gave, and a week later he came out. I was there for 15 days. I had two shirts, and I took turns wearing one and then wearing the other. And meanwhile, my whole family didn't even know what I was doing, and then they're watching on TV. This is the middle of the campaign where Mitt Romney suddenly appears and says that we've destroyed the life of this guy and we should all be fired. And then they go on TV and they show the list of people who are working on it who should all be fired, including my face is there as someone who should be fired. And then I got a series of calls from a series of congressmen. And they just berated me. And partly, I think, because I was at the end of my rope, I said, when we encountered this man, he had a broken foot and he was lying in a ditch. Now he's been admitted to the embassy. He has superb medical care. We obtained his scholarship-free admittance to 7 different universities, and now he's going to NYU. Can you explain to me how he's worse off for our intervention? And they couldn't answer the question. And they sort of dropped it. So anyway, that I could tell you more. It was an interesting experience, but it's one that will stick with me.
And I have a lot of highlights, as does Harold, that I could choose from, and I love sharing them because I think there is a bit of darkness, you might have noticed, in the air these days. And people, also even in our time, something like Syria and the Syrianization of the world, as some have called it, can really crowd out even the memory of what we did that was good and important and constructive, and even that which is lasting, which a lot of it I think will prove to be. But the example I will give, and you'll see why in a second, because I'll bring it back to today, involves LGBT rights, which is one of the hardest issues to make progress on internationally, because such a large subset of the countries that comprise the UN are themselves homophobic, certainly by culture and by practice, but also in the case of more than 70 countries by law, where it's actually prohibited, as it used to be in this country. And so to try to push water uphill on that set of issues was never going to be easy, but over the life of our time, initially I worked with Ambassador Rice when she was in my job in New York, and in that phase, I was the President's Human Rights Advisor. We got LGBT rights recognized as human rights in Geneva. Harold was, I think, involved in that as well at that time. But then we started to think, okay, well, what more can we do, beyond, kind of establishing this norm, which is important, and the effect of an altered norm may not be felt, for generations, but it's still about changing the DNA. And one of the things I realized was that ISIS was, for all of the groups that they were targeting in different ways, Christians and Sunni who just didn't get with the ISIS program, Shia, Yazidis, you name it, they also would very specifically target gay people and make them jump off buildings, kill them. And it struck me as just so shameful that the UN Security Council, the premier maker and shaper of international law, could get its act together over things that are very important: heritage, cultural heritage, the sale of artifacts, the horrible things they were doing. That we could pass a resolution on, but the idea of even discussing ISIS's targeting of LGBT people was completely unthinkable. So I wish I could tell you that we got a resolution, passed that criminalized or rendered illegal under international law what ISIS was doing to LGBT people. We did not, but we did manage to hold the first ever UN Security Council session on this issue. And true to form, we brought in two people who had been victimized by ISIS, who were trying to get asylum in this country. One of whom was granted asylum, and the other was about to be, and thought he was coming to this country, but some of what has happened with this administration appears to have derailed him, so he's likely to end up in Canada. But to have these two voices describing, for an array of governments, many of whom criminalized homosexuality, but for them to describe what ISIS was doing, it was sort of, it's almost like people say, when will there be world peace? When the Martians invade and it forces us all, to agree in a way that we wouldn't otherwise. ISIS was like the Martian, it was the one thing that surely everybody would be able to agree on, but this made those governments very, very uncomfortable. So we did that, and then not that long after that, the Orlando massacre happened. And in that moment, and again, you have these opportunities in diplomacy that grow out of the worst forms of human tragedy, and in this case, human horror. But it's a moment that one needs to move very quickly to try to take advantage of for the good, to find some good in it. And sure enough, the revulsion over what had happened and the sadness and the genuine empathy for the lives that had been lost and the survivors allowed us in the UN Security Council to secure an action condemning the targeting of people on the basis of their sexual orientation for the first time in the 71-year history of the UN. And so we did that, and then there is a core group of countries that come from North and South, mainly Latins, who come together to brainstorm about these kind of normative, incremental things that we can do with an eye to countries then being held accountable to these evolved and more, hopefully more progressive standards. And so I decided to convene the core group, because we only had a year left then in the Obama administration, at the Stonewall Inn in New York. And so we had this amazing experience at the Stonewall Inn. And there we discussed a couple things. One, very concrete and important, and the other symbolic and a little mischievous. The sneaky and mischievous, but I think also in its way important thing was we decided, or someone proposed, I think it was the Dutch ambassador proposed, that we try to paint the crosswalk that goes on First Avenue from, in effect, the rest of Manhattan into the UN in rainbow colors when the heads of state came to town. And so, if we'd been really mischievous, we would have posted, some kind of, whatever hidden camera where, these like Robert Mugabe crossing the, LGBT crosswalk and encapsulate that and broadcast it all over. And we didn't do the second thing, but we did manage, thanks to Bill de Blasio, but you can imagine the bureaucratics of getting this done. But we did manage to have the gathering of the heads of state, the entrances be rainbow-colored entrances our last year at the UN General Assembly. The more lasting thing that we did was that we worked with the Latin countries. They were actually in the lead very deliberately, because when the United States is in the lead, that can create a backlash of its own kind. And the Latins led, and we created the first ever sort of UN human rights position dedicated to measuring progress or lack thereof on LGBT rights. And that's the so-called independent expert on LGBT rights based out of Geneva. And today, this very day, this independent expert, who's a Thai gentleman who's actually stepping down, unfortunately for health reasons, but he'll be replaced, presented for the very first time to the General Assembly the results of his months of work documenting. And so all the countries are upset, or they're working really hard to find a way to undermine him. They tried to defund the position, so having lost in the Human Rights Council when we created this position, the Islamic states and the African countries in the lead, and with Russia and Chinese support, tried, through a bunch of different procedural mechanisms to take the position away. And so having lost on the substance in a body that, even for all of its flaws, allows you to get things like that done in Geneva because it's a smaller subset of the UN membership, they then tried to take advantage of the kind of more mob-like atmosphere that there is at times in New York. And, I think it was on 3 occasions, basically tried different ways to defund the position, most of which we held off by, 1 or 2 votes at different times. So for today, this individual to just go, just even him briefing and giving a venue, a receptacle for advocates around the world to bring their stories and to bring the documentation of what's happening to them in their communities, it's what passes at least for a victory these days. And I should say, it's an example of something very, very important and a takeaway, I think, for all of us after the last 8 years and coming into this 4 years that we will have, maybe, which is institutionalization. Right? Like, it's one thing to be good for 5 minutes on LGBT rights and push it and have a meeting, but it's another thing to embed the position within an organization, which means that no matter what the position of the current administration in the U.S. is on these issues, and it's not quite what ours was, that still lives. And this is the same thing that allowed us, and this doesn't get enough attention, on climate. The natural course of things in international law would have been for the Paris Agreement to have been negotiated on climate back in December 2015, finished. And then in the normal course of things, I think Kyoto, it took 9 years for that treaty to come into force for the requisite number of countries to actually have gotten it through their domestic ratification, even though we thought that Secretary Clinton was more likely than not to win. We did a full court press for the entire year between December 2015 and December 2016 to get the Paris Agreement to come into force so that we were less vulnerable to the results of the November election, and got it done actually, I think, just a couple days before the election itself. What that means is, even though we have to live with the horror of pulling out of Paris as a country potentially, if that's what happens, and we certainly have to live with the horror of pollutant policies and the undoing of really important regulations, what we don't have to live with is what we would have had to live with, that things were allowed to just take their course, which is the complete unraveling of the Paris Agreement as a whole. There'd be no Paris Agreement because the agreement comes into force when at least 55 countries who account for more than 55% of the emissions in the world are party to it. So we were party. We may now not be about to be party, but the agreement's already in the bag.
Let me just... Trump has declared his intent to withdraw from the Paris Agreement on November 4th, 2020, which is the day after the next presidential election. That's like my saying, I intend to move from my house in 4 years. Nothing has happened. It's legally meaningless. I went to a group of Europeans who said, the United States is in a state of virtual withdrawal. And I said, the United States is in. And, Trump does not own Paris. We do. And I think we should just say we'll always have Paris. By the way, I mean, tweets are not law.
Whatever they may be. So here's the question that I alerted you to that I want to ask. Idealism, realism, idealism without illusions, speaking from your own voice versus speaking as the United States government. Samantha, you recently said that during college you realized that you didn't want to go through your life, and I quote you, giving myself alibis for not trying to change my little slice of the world. And your magnificent book, A Problem from Hell, sharply criticized government officials for standing by during atrocities. And so then there you are, and you can't do everything you want to do. So are you still an idealist? How do you put that together? I know you're writing a book about this. So what
Funny
do
you should
think
ask. You know, I mean, to me, the hardest policies to be associated with, or certainly the hardest events on the ground to witness were those in Syria. You know, it was the largest mass atrocity of the last decade. You know, one of the largest of my lifetime. And as I indicated earlier with this phrase, the Syrianization of the world, the strategic effects of just the rise of ISIS and the displacement, you know, now 67 million people displaced around the world, you know, half the Syrian population displaced. Then the migration that followed from that. I mean, would there have been Brexit, you know, if the Syrian war hadn't degenerated to that extent? Would there be Trump if the fear and the sort of specter of difference and threat weren't, you know, available to people because of all the images out of this? You know, there's just a lot. It's one that was very hard to live with, and the hardest part day to day was just having, you know, people like Caesar, you know, who is the pseudonym for the gentleman who was a photographer in Syrian jails and took the photographs of tens of thousands of Syrians who'd been tortured and executed in Syrian jails, and who believed when he got out that if the world only knew, if they only saw these images where people literally had serial numbers, you know, carved into them, and, you know, acid poured all over them, and just, you know, I'm sure some of you at least have seen the photographs. And he came out and he told the story, and people were horrified. And, you know, we as an international community, we as the United States, all the countries that comprise the UN, didn't manage to move the ball in a manner that helped anybody else in a material way who was in a Syrian prison vulnerable to just those kinds of crimes. So I think the way, for me, I mean, Syria was a really hard one because it wasn't one, and maybe this is probably how complex policy decisions in real time just always feel, but it wasn't one where, while I had ideas for things that we might be doing that we weren't doing, you know, it wasn't like I could come home and just say, you know, Cass, they won't listen to me. I have the idea for what's going to solve this, you know, sectarian conflict and going to mitigate, if not solve, you know, mitigate the suffering of millions of people. Like it just, the complexity felt kind of almost overdetermined by so many of these demons that have been unleashed on the ground. And you do, and I knew this from, I'd interviewed hundreds of people to write A Problem from Hell, but you when you're in the room in real time, as I tried to document even in the book, but the limits of what you know are very salient to you. And the sense of, you know, kind of epistemological humility, right, about what you don't know and all that lies out there. So that could sound like an alibi of the kind that you described, but it was just the context in which, you know, I would keep still trying to climb up the hill with ideas for things we might do that might make things a little bit better. And John Kerry was the same way, and I found a lot of solidarity in him and even till the very last day he was in office as Secretary of State, just the effort he made to try to gin up a peace process, a political process, which is ultimately how this thing has to end. My way of living with Syria, apart from all the other examples I could give you about things we did on other areas, was just if I'd come out of a meeting and I'd, you know, it was clear that the thing I was proposing was going nowhere, and I couldn't get support from my colleagues, or the UN Security Council for that matter. If I got the U.S. government, or we the U.S. government, were in what I thought was a good place, but then we were thwarted by Russia, I would come back to my team, and this is sort of a motto of mine, and say, okay, so what now? And the motto was, there's always something we can do. Like there was just, even in Syria, there was always something we could do. So we didn't solve the war, the Syrianization and the pain of all those people persisted, but I would focus on a single political prisoner, who I couldn't get the Russian ambassador to go along with me on, sanctioning the Assad regime for the crimes that they had committed in their prisons, but I could get him to engage his Russian counterpart in Damascus, and get that individual through, again, my Russian counterpart at the UN, to go to the Syrian government and try to get this guy out of jail. Like, it's sort of like the story of one individual. These stories get lost, but, my team could never, it would be a terrible state to have the privileges of being in these positions of public service and not every day be thinking, okay, we can't do X, we're not going to solve the whole thing, but what is the little piece of this? So we got a resolution through the Russians. This is going to sound so modest and tame, but it was so important to allow, for the Russians to roll the Syrian government basically and allow humanitarian assistance to come across the international borders to people who were living in opposition territory. The Syrian government's position was, we're the sovereign, you got to bring your food to Damascus before you go to any of these, breakaway rebel areas. And this was absurd because it was too dangerous to get to Damascus in some cases. And if it got to Damascus, all the food was going to be taken. It would never get. So again, just through wearing down the Russians and using some public shaming around how can you block humanitarian assistance to these vulnerable people, we were able, and so now, even though everything else is still terrible in Syria, at least these areas that would otherwise have no UN assistance, none of the big, factory-like flow convoys of food, none of that would be existing. But for, again, to try to continue to find that one thing you can do against a backdrop of, ultimately not being able to do what you wish you could.
Harold, you've described the legal advisor to the State Department as conscience for the United States government with regard to international law. And I have a suspicion that there were times that you were arguing for particular positions, maybe not on the law, but on the policy, that didn't become the ultimate positions. And I just wonder, how did that ever happen? And how do you deal with being not winning?
Well, let me ask you, Martha, did you ever have to defend a tenure decision with which you didn't fully agree?
I actually didn't have that experience, but I absolutely have had to do thing. I mean, that's what I'm asking. It's the role, having a role. Yeah.
You're part of a team.
Yeah.
I should have said, when I was in college, I was a physics major until my junior year, and then I took a class on government, and I'm sitting in the class, and the guy starts talking about the in and outers. And I didn't know what that was, and so I said, what's that? And he said, oh, scholar ambassadors. And I said, who? Like who? He said, Henry Kissinger, John Kenneth Galbraith, Patrick Moynihan. They have the best life because they have tenure, but then they can go into the government and go back and forth. So I actually wrote a paper about this. And that sort of started my thinking about it. Now, there are risks of doing that, In the faculty lounge, you can be right. And then if people disagree, you go get another cookie. No, I mean, you could say inconsistent things from week to week, and people don't hold you to it. But in government, you are part of a large group trying to make decisions. And, judges say things like, I just see myself as an umpire, calling balls and strikes. Of course, everybody has their own strike zone. But anyway, I didn't want to be a judge. I didn't want to be an umpire. I want to play the game. And if you play the game, even if you're Ted Williams, 6 times out of 10, you don't get a hit. So the question is, how do How do you move the ball forward on the things you care about? I had 3 rules. Rule number 1, the airplane rule. If you're in at the takeoff, you can be in at the landing. So I would not defend the decision that I didn't participate in the making of. But if I participated in the making of it and I lost in a fair fight, that's, you defend it. Just as you do when you're a dean. Rule number 2 is you're only as good as your principals. P-L-E-S and P-A-L-S. You're only as good as the people you work for, the principals. So work for people you think have great capacities. Otherwise, you'll find yourself limited by their limitations. And you're only as good as your principles, P-L-E-S, the things that you stand up for. As William Sloane Coffin used to say, if you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. And then the 3rd rule I got from Derek Bach. I was sitting with him at a dinner here, and I said to him, "What's your advice about leadership?" And he was great. He said, "You ever play pinball?" And I said, "Yeah, I played a lot of pinball." He goes, "If you don't shake the machine, you're not really playing." And he goes, "But if you tilt it, you're not a very good player either. So shake it, but don't tilt it." And so wherever I was, I thought, am I shaking the machine? And how close are we to tilt? You want to be right there, right at that edge.
Can I share one little short anecdote? Just what it's like to. So Harold and I were allies on pretty much on everything, and it was amazing just to know. I'd be in this seat like on landmines. We were trying to get us to ban landmines, and we'd just look, and there'd just be this one smiling, cherubic face as I'm chairing these meetings from the White House, and he's my great ally. But early on, and I can't remember why it was, but I think it was a meeting on the International Criminal Court that I was chairing, again in my capacity as the President's Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights Advisor. Harold was representing the State Department at this meeting. There would have been a lot of ICC skeptics. It would have been relatively early in 2009, probably not long after you were confirmed. But anyway, apparently I chaired this meeting in a way that was very, kind of, I just work here, kind of, I'm, just calling balls and strikes. Like, go ahead, Harold. Oh, that's a great point. Now, what about you, sir? What are the arguments you think for us having nothing to do with this body, as which wants to pursue Americans and do all these terrible things? And so anyway, Harold got very mad at me. And do you remember this at all? So you called me. You didn't come to my office. You just called me. So I was like, Harold's on the phone. I was like, oh, Harold, like a warm dad. One of my few true soulmates, allies in government. And he just starts laying into me. He's like, you need to go home and read your book. Read your book. You seem to have forgotten what you wrote. And I was like, all right. This is a really, really important thing, because it's a little bit like what can happen at law school. What I was describing earlier is that you can, there are roles that you occupy. And in those roles, it's appropriate to hear all views, but you don't lose sight of what you believe, or how you want the orchestra to play the song, basically, and where you want it to land. And so I was like, oh, I don't know what happened to me there for a minute. Sorry. And so then we went back to business together. But it was, and he had said, even when I was first going into government, he said, occasionally. And he was just entering for the second time, but in his previous human rights job, he said, occasionally in government, I would go home and I would read what I had written so I could remember what I thought. And so there he was. I thought it was fair that he was chastising me to do the same thing.
One important thing is, when I first got to the State Department in 1998, a guy pulled me, I was the head of the Human Rights Bureau, a guy pulled me aside. He said, at the State Department, we hate 4 things. And I said, what's that? He said, political appointees, human rights people, lawyers, and professors. So I have a message for the younger students here. They're not waiting with bated breath for you to come in and make the theory of your last article the government policy. And so you have to basically work with the people who are there and what they're trying to accomplish. And you know, I keep getting asked about articles I wrote. The fact of the matter is that nobody in the U.S. government cared what my position as a scholar is on the War Powers Resolution. It's what are the opinions of the legal advisor's office, and where do my views fit into that? Finally, you know, when you work in a field for a long time, you learn things. And at one point, somebody said to me, "I think what you're saying is inconsistent with something you said in some article you wrote." And I said, "Well, what do you think matters more? What I put in a footnote when I was coming up for tenure when I was 27, or what I say after a lifetime of thinking about these issues, going to the government twice, dealing with it now, and addressing it in this life and death setting?" I don't defer to myself as a 27-year-old trying to impress somebody with my footnote. And neither, you know, listen to me now.
That's very good. Well, we're living, as you've already alluded to, at a time after the term of the president under whom you both served, and there's been a lot of changes. The United States has disengaged from UNESCO. They've talked a little bit about the Paris climate deal. Some people say Pax Americana is over, the post-World War II way of dealing with global issues. There's certainly one major change is at least the rhetoric about whether the United States has a role to play in the world. And talk about roles. As dean, I would be leaning over backwards. Whatever anyone thinks this might be great for America, might be bad for America. I'm not dean, so I'm not going to do that. But what do you think about this? What do you predict? What's the consequence of this new moment for us?
Well, I think for starters, this moment and this protracted period is hastening and will really accelerate the rise and the prominence and the leadership of China in the international system. And as two human rights people here, and you just heard one sort of actually by the standard of the crackdown underway that's been underway in China now for some time, you know, relatively good news story of someone who was able to get out, but for China to be asserting itself on the global stage where there is now a vacuum, it will inevitably mean projecting their domestic pathologies, you know, into global statecraft. They actually, up to this point, punch, you know, a little bit below their weight in the sense that they are very active in blocking action, like on the Rohingya, on Burma, very active in trying to prevent discussion of North Korea as a human rights issue. But we haven't seen the beginnings of this. And Graham Allison, our colleague at the Kennedy School, has a book out that I recommend to people, which looks at the question of whether China and the United States are destined for war. Doesn't think that we are, but thinks there are a set of factors that mean that every policymaker needs to take this prospect very seriously. But just the stat that leaps out at me, indicative of China's rise, I just share it with you because it's so eye-popping to me, at least was, is that China produced and used more cement between 2011 and 2013 than the United States did in the entire 20th century. You know, so just that, and that's a bricks and mortar example, but imagine that getting translated into policy leadership when there isn't another vocal kind of pull on the other side. And I saw this even as I was leaving New York. It was the first time in the budget negotiations, because China is now the #2 donor to UN peacekeeping, which is like an $8 billion budget. And they've been a very small donor for so many years, but now it's measured on the basis of your share of the global economy and per capita income and stuff. So now they're #2, right behind us. And so for the very first time, they moved away from the developing countries in the budget negotiations with whom they'd always been affiliated as the G77 plus China. But they didn't want to be with us and the Western countries, so they just put their chair between like these two negotiating blocks. And we still thought this could be helpful because they have a lot of leverage with these countries because they're a much bigger development donor now than we are, or than all of the Western countries are really combined. So we thought this could be helpful and influential. We could maybe get a sensible budget with, cutting some of the bloat that needs to be cut. And sure enough, they were much more budget conscious because they were on the hook in a way that they hadn't been before. But the things that they wanted to cut were the human rights positions from all the peacekeeping missions. So that's one example. And then the second thing I'd say is just, other than China's rise, in terms of us, I mentioned earlier, I think, that often new presidents take over and we're kind of like goldfish. We think that, like, I'm a goldfish and I just get to start over and have new thoughts in a given day and lead in a different way. And I think this has been true of American history, that we don't see that other countries see this continuity in our policies. I think the cost of breaking our word on the Iran deal or on Paris, the cost of, daily falsehoods coming from the highest office in the land, the cost of embracing police brutality vocally and even arguably sexual assault. I mean, those are not costs from which we just get to elect somebody else and then say, hey guys, we're back. We believe in things again, and we believe that in order to keep our people safe, we have to engage the world, and that in effect our security and our humanity is linked. Like, we believe that, and we're back. And and now we'll go back to, hopefully, we won't have a nuclear war in the meantime, and we'll go back to like all the things we've walked away. It's not going to work that way. Not only because of China's rise, but because, as a very senior European official, the National Security Advisor to a very prominent European head of state, said to me recently, the problem with us, we're going to have us meaning Europe, we're going to have post-traumatic stress about this period, because it isn't that Trump is your president, it is that you elected Trump. So now we have these two data points. You elected Barack Obama, and not from the standpoint of foreign policy, people have their critiques of Barack Obama that I'm sure are fair, but now you're capable of electing and supporting this, and so what does that mean? How can we rely again on you being able to stick to who you say you are? So that's the word. But maybe Harold will say something happy about the Trump legacy. The checks and balances. Maybe you should talk about the checks and balances, because you've been Mr. Check and Balance.
So for the last 9 months, you turn on the TV in the morning, it's Trump this, Trump that. And it reminds me of the famous joke by Mel Brooks, the 2,000-year-old man, where they say to him, he's playing a 2,000-year-old man, before God, was there anybody else? And the 2,000-year-old man says, yeah, there was a guy named Phil. And they said, what happened? He said, we'd say, oh, Phil, don't hurt us and don't beat us and don't make our lives miserable. And then one day, lightning came out of the sky and struck Phil dead, and we said, there's something bigger than Phil. Well, there's something bigger than Trump, which is this whole process that we all own. And he may be a major player, but as I said in the panel this morning, he may want to put in a Muslim ban called the travel ban. He announced it on January 27th, and the groups that have risen up to litigate against it, it's been in effect for less than 24 hours. He may want a transgender ban. The bureaucracy is resisting. He may want to pull out of Paris. All he's done is say that he will pull out of Paris in the future at a time when he may no longer be president. He might say he wants to decertify the Iran nuclear deal, but he's going to kick it to Congress, and it's not clear that they're going to do anything different, because actually they don't have anything better than the Iran deal. And in fact, what could be a worse time to renege on the Iran deal when what you're trying to develop is some sort of nuclear diplomacy with North Korea? So Martin Luther King said, the arc of history is long and bends toward justice. It doesn't bend by itself. We were lucky. We could afford to withdraw from this process and let, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and John Kerry and Samantha Power do the right thing in our names. But that time no longer exists. In this room are 5 people who signed a brief on behalf of national security officials, former national security officials of both parties, who say, look, this travel ban is not based on a process that deserves judicial deference. There was no process. They've actually explained no national security rationale for it. To this day, they have yet to produce a single person from any of these countries who committed a terrorist killing in the United States. And in fact, Trump himself says he would bomb for Syrian children who he will not admit to the country. So I think we have a right to say, it's not, what is going on here is not deference to the president and a process we respect. What's going on instead is the question of whether the process we respect is being followed by the person who happens to hold the position of president. And if not, that does not warrant deference from the courts. You know, we don't have a wild split in the circuits about the travel ban. Every single court that's ruled basically has ruled against it over and over and over again. Or take the transgender ban. You know, the Defense Department under Ash Carter, who teaches at the Kennedy School, had made the process to remove the transgender ban for the good of the military to be effectuated on January 2018. And then suddenly we get a tweet saying transgender individuals will be removed from service. Why? Because it disrupts unit cohesion. Well, guess what? 18 of our NATO allies have transgender people in their forces. American soldiers serve alongside those transgender individuals and have done so for years. And nobody said that those units are not cohesive. So it's demonstrably false. So today, I think as we speak, we have a clinic at Yale Law School called the Rule of Law Clinic. We're filing a brief on behalf of 50 generals and military officials, including Chuck Hagel, Leon Panetta, Admiral Stavridis, General McChrystal, saying if there's no process, it's an attempt to disguise rank discrimination as based on national security imperative, and the court should not defer to that because there's no professional judgment being exhibited. So, you know, when we sent the brief out, we didn't expect 50 generals to suddenly rush to sign it, but it turns out that people who have worked in this process and respect it don't respect the way that their own work is being undermined and manipulated in the name of discrimination.
I want to ask a question about surprising friendships. Have you made any surprising friendships in the course of your public service?
I think the friendship that surprises most people that was probably my most important diplomatic friendship was that with the Russian ambassador. So the same individual who was representing a country that was lopping off part of a neighbor, killing children in Syria, and interfering with our election and committing an assault on our democracy was my friend. Go figure. So why was he my friend? He was my friend because he worked every day to try to wring out of his government whatever positive action there was to be wrung out. And a little bit like what Harold, well, actually different from what Harold was saying, he would not have met Harold's standard of if you're in at the takeoff, you're in on the landing, because Putin doesn't operate that way. No one's in on the takeoff except Putin, who then lands the plane. So I think there's a very real question, and I suspect it was one he grappled with about, you know, whether the cost-benefit for him, you know, in terms of his own integrity and future made sense for him in all of this, but he stayed loyal to the end. He passed away very suddenly earlier this year. And I was struck, Martha, you and I talked about it at the time. I wrote a piece saying, basically describing my friendship with him, which no one knew about, for obvious reasons. It would not have been good for either of us. And I described, the work that he did helping me on Syrian political prisoners and, the peacekeeping missions that exist today that wouldn't have existed if his system would have just been allowed to just reject whatever we were proposing. And I got so much hate mail, just so much, like, how could you? You're an apologist for this. And this gets to this question of ideals as lived in the real world. I respect the judgment of people who think that it was inappropriate to have a friendship with him. And I could have just had a working relationship. And I could have avoided getting to know his wife and him, my family and so forth. But he was a compelling person with whom I did compelling work and had dramatic clashes. But what struck me about the response I got to writing about this complex relationship, including describing the loathsome things I thought he was doing, was that in our current moment, protracted moment, there feels like there's no space for this kind of gray zone, of completely seeing the terribleness of what he's doing in defending, and certainly the complete horrors of his government, and the idea that he would be out there defending, like judging that, calling it out, operating with my own government to try to get us to take measures to hold, his government accountable. That on the one hand, and yet being able to build something with him that would allow us both, I think, for lack of a better word, to sort of optimize in this moment of almost Cold War-like tension. And just that reaction reminded me of our own domestic political moment. There's no space. I mean, occasionally Trump does something that's okay, and I make a point, like he, helped get these hostages, Caitlin Boyle and her husband, out of Pakistan. And I wrote kudos to the Trump administration, just on Twitter, kudos to the Trump administration for getting this done. And I got this, screed of, they did nothing. This was only Pakistan. They couldn't do it. Almost like they are the Taliban. Don't you know? Like, if you read everything else I've said in response to the things they've done lately, I'm aware of the horror show that is being perpetrated by our government. I get it, but they can still, do good things, and recognizing that, and we're going to be in this world for a while. Affirming and showing that we're capable of differentiating is a part of what we need more of, it feels like, in this moment. But I recognize that's not popular everywhere. We're in a binary, everything feels very binary at present, unfortunately.
My most unexpected friend was John Brennan, who is head of the CIA. He's a professional CIA agent. But, and I didn't even know him. But we agreed most of the time because he's a Jesuit and he believes in just war. And he's Irish. Now, little noticed was that the Irish mafia ran the foreign policy. Brennan, Samantha Power, Tom Donilon, Dennis McDonough.
Barack Obama.
Jake Sullivan. I have a kinship with those people because I'm married to an Irish American, but I'm also Korean. And Korean, as you know, are the Irish of the East. Because both of us having grown up in the shadow of a more boring, larger colonial power, developed a sort of puckish irreverence, which is, I think, what made me connect to Samantha. But by the way, if you believe in just war theory, it explains a lot. I was often asked, aren't you a hypocrite? You oppose torture, but you think that drones can be used lawfully? To which my answer is no, torture is always illegal. Everywhere, no matter when it's done. Unless you're a pacifist, and I'm not, sometimes you go to war. And in war, there are laws of war. And drones are not per se illegal. If they're used in a certain way, it can be a lawful, lethal act in war. And if it's not used that way, it's illegal. And if you're going to be a lawyer in the government, during that period, your job is to define the line between lawful and unlawful killing. And, that's not what I signed up for in life. I memorized the names of all my students. For 4 years, I memorized the name of all senior al-Qaeda leaders. But here's the thing. You want the lawyers there. So when you hear a politician say, let's get the lawyers off the backs of the generals, you say, absolutely not. Don't you dare. That's the difference between whether you're engaging in lawful acts of war or murder. And the idea that lawyers or lawfare, or these things are over-lawyered, that's ridiculous. That's exactly what we need, especially if we are going to engage in warfare as a necessary part of surviving in a hostile and difficult world.
Well, I'm going to ask as a last question what advice you have for any students who may be in this room.
I have been doing some speaking to mainly college audiences, not law school audiences lately, and I've been struck on the one hand by a new level of engagement, but on the other hand already a self-expressed fatigue. We're tired, we've been in all these protests, and kind of not seeing I think Harold did a great job, ticking off the non-return on the attempts to make a set of changes that people, many people, sadly not enough people, but object to. So there's that as a kind of morale boost for people to be reminded of that. That kind of positive feedback loop is very, very important. But I think sort of stamina, you used the word earlier, I think, patience, asking oneself in these times, okay, I came to law school and I was going to do this. I was in law school to do this thing. I may still want to do this thing on the other side of law school or in law school, but what's the new thing I'm going to do? And my favorite sign in the many protests that have gone on is that it was a middle-aged guy, kind of heavy-set guy at one of the women's protests, one of the women's marches, and he was holding up a sign and it said, I'm not usually a sign guy, but geez. So I guess my last words are just like, what do you not usually? But that when you're saying every day, like, oh, no, or geez, what do you not usually that it's now time to become? And if you don't have a ready answer to that, come back to what I was saying earlier about, like, even if you're living with the equivalent of Syria every day, there's always something you can do. If you can't be of Harold's stature, like actually leading this, the preparation of these briefs to block the implementation of this horrific racist and discriminatory ban, if you can't do that, some of us aren't capable of doing that. Refugees are still trickling into this country, and they're all over this country, coming without speaking English in many cases, and they're resettling in our communities, including right here in Massachusetts. And they're resettling in the least hospitable climate for welcoming refugees, since the Second World War. Just helping them move in, or buying them or making them a home-cooked meal or something. And there's just always something. And I think part of the Trump problem for many is that it just feels so big that anything any one person does feels so incommensurate to these structural changes and this unleashing, of statements and actions that we never thought we thought we were past, like generations past. It can just feel daunting and make people tired. But once one starts doing that small thing, I think that's empowering and invigorating and sets us up then for what amounts to a long haul of getting things back on track.
Well, let me ask the students a question and then leave them with an image. When I was a second-year student, I agonized, I think around now, about whether I'd work for a big firm in one city or a big firm in another city. I agonized for months. And then finally I picked it, and I told my mother. And she said, oh, that's nice. I said, I was thinking about working for firm A, and I decided to work for firm B. And my mother goes, oh, that's nice. Did they need you the most? And I said, what do you mean? She said, you have so much privilege. You have the best education money that can buy. That's all we could give you. Shouldn't you be serving the people with the least privilege? The image, though, is yesterday when we were at the Sanders Theater, all the justices are asked, if you couldn't be, if you were told you couldn't be a justice, what would you rather be? And they also, I'd like to be a history professor. I had to tell you, I thought that was pretty disappointing. Like, if you couldn't be a law professor, you'd be a history professor. And then one person said, well, maybe I'd be an art history professor. Well, you know what I would be? Samantha will like it. I want to be the third base coach of the Boston Red Sox. We love the Red Sox because that's how you become an American. It is. It is. My son said to me, I love Fenway Park because it's the only place in America where 6'3" blonde guys are wearing shirts that say Ortiz and Matsuzaka. So when I was little, I thought I wanted to be Ted Williams, and then I got older, and I thought, well, as I was dean, I thought I should be Theo Epstein, and then I thought, as I get older and older, maybe I should be a relief pitcher, Tim Wakefield. But the other day I was watching, and I thought, the best job is the third base coach. He's on the field. He has the best view. He's part of the team. He goes into the dugout between innings, and he imparts wisdom, and he spits, and and he only does two things during the game. One is sometimes he says, not now, not yet, not yet. But sometimes, and most of the time, he says, run. Run like the wind, run like the wind. You're young, run like the wind. Go for it. Give it everything you've got. And I don't care what the outcome is. You did it. You took that chance. That's why I love being a third base coach.
Harold Coe, Samantha Power, you live lives of run like the wind, engagement, reflection. You get close. Your brilliance, your conscience. You deal with media criticism, cost, away from your families, and I think we all thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.